I think that the only pathway to authentic flourishing is through an acceptance and a real engagement with existential realities. I think a lot of psychological dis-ease, a lot of defensiveness, a lot of interpersonal conflict, intra-group turmoil, ideologically motivated violence stems from our inability or unwillingness to see existential concerns as the reality as they are. And so if we could work together personally and collectively to embrace these existential realities as truths and not threats, as facts and not fears, I think that it would be transformative, because that's the only way to fully appreciate what it means to be a bounded human and then make decisions in light of that to engage in a full and flourishing life.
I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, and this is Beauty at Work, the podcast that seeks to expand our understanding of beauty, what it is, how it works, and why it matters for the work we do. This season of the podcast is sponsored by John Templeton Foundation and Templeton Religion Trust. Hey everybody, this is the second half of my conversation with psychologist Daryl Van Tongeren and philosopher David McPherson about spiritual yearning. Please check out the first part if you haven't already. So far, we've talked about Daryl's research on the duns, people who've left religion, and David's work on alienation. In this episode, we're going to talk about the data on spiritual yearning among the duns, how we make sense of those who say they don't experience such yearnings at all, and why we need to take our existential concerns more seriously. Let's get started. Daryl, I wanted to ask, what do you think of alienation as a way to conceptualize what's happening when people encounter these sort of four horsemen? And you have a concept of the existential chasm in your book. Could you talk about how that relates to this notion of alienation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in part, besides cognitive dissonance being kind of a major reason why people are leaving, in another sense, it could be that they're no longer feeling as though their religion is meeting their needs, and they're somehow feeling alienated from their religious teachings or institutions or from other religious individuals. And so the process of leaving religion for those who are undergoing a major belief revision that's landed them outside of traditional religion, I introduced this idea of the existential chasm, and it goes something like this. So religion addresses a lot of core existential needs. What's the meaning of life? What happens to me after I die? When people leave religion, they have to answer those questions again without religion. And so they're facing these new existential fears afresh without being able to rely on religion to provide them with ready answers. And so there's two kind of unique things about this. One is if they've previously known what it was like to, let's say, believe in the afterlife, and maybe that's a belief that they've jettisoned, that's going to bring about a whole lot of grief, because if you comforted yourself by losing a loved one or a friend by believing that they would live on in the afterlife and you no longer believe that, you might be grieving them again. And if you've oriented your life around where to go to college, what profession to choose, whom to marry or partner off with based on your religious beliefs, and now you no longer hold those, you might grieve having spent so much of your life and so many major life decisions oriented around something that you no longer believe. So you're facing these new existential challenges in a brand new way, no longer having the structures of religion, but knowing what it was like. And then the second piece is, for many people who are raised religiously, they may not have developed the skills or the capacities or the habits of critically thinking about how to engage these existential concerns on their own, because they might have been given a kind of a complete comprehensive worldview through religion to address these concerns. And so there's this gap. So existential anxiety is likely heightened among people who have left religion because they can't rely on or are no longer relying on religion to meet those needs, and they're facing them once again. And so for these folks, existential concerns are going to loom larger, and they might feel like they don't have much of a place to turn, and they feel more alienated and alone.
Yeah. So how does one respond to that? I mean, you talk about cultivating some kind of spiritual practice as one route. And is that something that people long for? And I suppose maybe the question that I could also ask is, in the aftermath of leaving religion, is there a kind of yearning, or do people shut it off and say, I'm just going to live my life according to something else?
Yeah. In some of our recent work with colleagues, what we're finding is that, people are yearning. So we've done some work with religious duns and people who've never been religious, and we ask them, are you looking for something more? And among those, they've got mild yearnings, and they're kind of looking for a few things. So one of the things they're looking for is something that looks and seems like and feels like religion, but isn't religion. So basically something to replicate what religion gave them, but without the costly parts of religion. They're looking for connection with other people, right? They're looking for that community. They're also looking for transcendent connection and lasting meaning. Like they want to know that whatever they're doing here is going to be remembered and is going to make a difference over the long term. And then the last thing they're really yearning for are these supernatural experiences. And religion offers those. And outside of religion, it's really hard to get some of those supernatural experiences, which, David alluded to the idea that maybe that's why we're seeing this uptick in interest in psychedelics is maybe, is it this way to quickly get to supernatural experiences without, in some cases, traditional religious structures. I similarly share the belief that spiritual yearning is probably just as natural as the desire to make meaning. So to the degree that we're trying to make sense of the world around us and our place in the world, we're natural meaning makers. And one of the deepest and most enduring ways that you can make meaning is by connecting with something larger than yourself. And that's really this feeling or sense of transcendent spirituality. So when people leave, it's not as if they no longer have spiritual needs or long for something larger than themselves. They're probably just looking for it in different areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How much do you think that the people who leave religion really need to cultivate some kind of spiritual practice? Is that necessary? Is it, are these sorts of needs that they, once could find answers for in religion important? Is this a universal human quality that we ought to pay attention to?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are other sources of spirituality besides religion. So I think of spirituality as that relational connection with the transcendent or divine or sacred. And religion's one of the vehicles through which people can experience spiritual connection, but they can experience it in nature, through the cosmos, through connecting with other humans, through an authentic and sense of integrity within themselves. So I do think that there are features that allow for spiritual connection or transcendence, but should we be cultivating these, right? Or should we, is it an important thing? I would say probably so. I don't, and people are going to have different perspectives on this, and there's going to be individual differences and variation, but I don't think that we should neglect or let wither something that has long been a part of human flourishing across millennia, across cultures. There's always been this notion of the spiritual, of something larger than oneself. And I do think that's important to attend to and important for us to consider, not letting what let wither, but instead, how do we cultivate some type of spiritual practices that will meet those needs, even if it looks different from how it's previously been done in traditionally organized religious settings?
Yeah. There might be people who, I know, we've encountered some scientists who say, look, I don't care about spirituality. I don't even know what you mean by connection when you ask me that question.
Right.
What do you think of that kind of, is it possible to be completely sort of tone deaf to the spiritual, or just not need it at all and still live a flourishing life?
Yeah, I certainly think that there are people for whom what we're talking about just is absolutely of no interest to them, or they don't really spend much of their day thinking about these types of questions. And probably by every kind of measure and metric, they would probably report their life's probably just fine. Like, it's meaningful enough. They've got work if they're able to. They've got relationships if, they likely have relationships. Maybe they have a hobby. So they have things to fill their time. And they probably have things that make their life quite meaningful. And one might imagine, though, that even richer sense of meaning might be available to those who are willing to cultivate a sense of spirituality. But it would not presume that a lack of spirituality means that someone is living necessarily in a deficit.
Mm-hmm. David, what do you think in terms of, as human beings, as meaning-seeking creatures, is the sort of response of someone who says, look, I don't need this stuff? How do you make sense of that? Is it just that there's enough scaffolding that they don't have to confront themselves with universal questions that percolate from within us? Or is that just that there is, is there a viable way of living a human, maybe a life of fullness that doesn't require dealing with these existential questions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to add one thing just kind of on the spiritual alienation bit, because I think it connects up with this. I think it's helpful to distinguish between spiritual alienation and religious alienation. So I think, for instance, a lot of Daryl's work is on what I might call religious alienation. So people who are like done with religion or sort of in some way alienated from religion. And one of the interesting questions is like, does that make the spiritual search more difficult? Does it exacerbate the sort of more fundamental spiritual alienation that sort of I argue we all have, right? I mean, a great example of this is Nietzsche's when he proclaims the death of God. He sort of describes two experiences. One is a kind of, you might call it existential vertigo, where it's like which way is up, which way is down. You're trying to find an orientation in life, right? Trying to find a meaningful life orientation. And then the second experience is, at least he describes as a more positive one, which is this experience of like an open sea of like possibilities that is sort of like you're liberated from certain kinds of restrictions. So for some people, they may actually find it easier, right? If they're sort of throwing off some baggage from their past, although they're sort of tasked with this like, which path then, right? And I think spiritual practices do play an important role just as vehicles of our longing, right? They're ways of, whether it's prayer or meditation or whatever it might be, I think that they play an important role as vehicles of our longing. Now, I do find this question very interesting of like the person who like says that they don't have any spiritual longings. They're like, I don't even know what you're talking about. So like Max Weber famously, he said that he was religiously unmusical, that he just, in other words, he didn't resonate with sort of like religious or spiritual questions. But nevertheless, when he was like asked like why he does his work, he said, I want to see how much I can stand, right? It's sort of this image of like this courageous person facing the bleakness of reality and carrying on nevertheless, right? And so I think oftentimes there are these sources of meaning. So even if they don't find any larger meaning in the cosmos, they may find personal meaning just in sort of confronting this. Now, of course, there are cases of like people who just go through their lives and maybe don't reflect on it too much, right? But this is sort of that midlife crisis experience that can come up. Like you might think just, being human, like there's just questions that are going to arise sooner or later, right? You come up against some failure in your life, or you come up against mortality, or you come up against a tragedy and suffering. You're trying to make sense of it, right? And so this is a sense in which, like, while people might not frame it as like some of it's the framing of like spiritual longing, right? But you might switch to like thinking about meaning, right? So another way to think about like spiritual yearning is just to talk about in terms of like the search for meaning. And I do think we are fundamentally meaning-seeking creatures, and we seek meaning in lives. We want our lives to be significant. We want our lives to matter. So I think in that sense, sometimes you just have to frame the reference. I mean, like spirituality can sound spooky to people. Like it can sound like, ghosts and goblins and whatnot, right? I mean, so it's like, and people are maybe of a more kind of like, spirit or soul or whatever that they may not. I mean, partly I just think of it as this realm, what you might call, as one philosopher, John McDowell, calls it, the space of meaning, right? We live in the space of meaning. We sort of swim in it. We're already in the midst of it. So in that sense, I think if we reframe it as like search for meaning or search for fullness, I think as you did yourself, I think it's more easier to see how that's kind of a universal human quest. So sometimes I think it's the language or the baggage associated with certain language that can hold us up. But maybe there are people like, I don't seek meaning. I just want to, I sometimes I'll use this, what I call the Jim Morrison position. The lead singer of the Doors at the end of their live album, at the end of Roadhouse Blues, he's talking about like, astrology and all these sort of things. He says, I don't believe in it though. I think it's a bunch of bullshit. I tell you this though, I'm going to get my kicks in before the whole shit house goes up in flames. Right. And it's sort of this like, he's just gonna seek pleasure. Right. And so that would seem to be like example of like, if someone's just kind of living more, you might call like in a non-human animalistic kind of way, but it's not even clear that that's fully possible. I mean, Kierkegaard will talk about this with his account of the aesthete, the person who lives for the kind of immediacy of the moment. And the problem is you get bored and you begin to reflect upon your life. And so while not all the time are we always engaged in sort of meaning-seeking activities or like what we might call spiritual yearnings, I think they have a way of cropping up. And sometimes I think like thou dost protest too much when people are like, I'm religiously unmusical. Like clearly like Weber, for instance, was very moved by and attuned to the sort of hard, big questions. I mean, he's the one who sort of coined the term, the disenchantment of the world, right? And how do we go on in science as like, in the face of like disenchantment, right? So I would say he's a person very alive to what we might call spiritual or existential questions. So maybe existential could be, and Daryl I know uses this framing as well, sometimes existential. So I think it's how you frame it, I guess, is how I would put it.
Yeah, I wonder at times whether, we build lives to inoculate ourselves from these questions, because they are pesky, right? They have a way of erupting in ways. These aren't questions that, or maybe some of us could sit around and sort of ask these questions in a kind of laconic way, but that's not how often they crop up, right? There seems to be, a kind of, yeah, it's almost like, I have this image of even like a plant sort of shooting up from hard, rocky ground, right? So it's almost when the cracks in our narratives, our societal narratives or our personal narratives start to reveal themselves, or we've got some kind of breakdown in our routines and habits, and unexpected tragedies are often the ways in which some of these things might crop up. And then we have to either really shore up a defense against these questions in some way, or just try to live them. The question of yearning becomes interesting because the yearning has a kind of, it's not just a pesky question, but then there's also this longing, there's almost desire, right? That's built into it. And there's, David, you're familiar with this Seinfeld clip, right? Which we shared at the convening we were at a few months ago, where Kramer sidles up to George and asks him if he ever yearns, and George says, "Well, yearn, well, I crave sometimes." and can we live lives that are entirely lives dedicated to following cravings, but not yearning? And is that a reasonable account of fullness, to just pursue craving?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. Because I was thinking about this when you were mentioning your Buddhist scientist friend earlier, because of course the Buddhist, like teaching is like the problem of selfish craving, right? But it doesn't necessarily, there's ways I think of reading the Buddhist tradition as like totally allowing for yearning, right? Like this, we're trying to achieve this state of nirvana, right? We yearn for it, where we're not sort of consumed by sort of selfish craving, where we're acting more compassionate, more in tune with the world in some way, right? And so I think we have to distinguish between like kinds of desires. There's like, those appetitive kind of like maybe selfish cravings, the sort of thing that maybe Jim Morrison was talking about when he wanted to get his kicks in, right? But then there's like the yearning, which I think, sometimes that language can sound overwrought, like, oh, I yearn, like, and so some people may react to the overwroughtness of the sound of I yearn for this, right? But I think it's usually, it's hard not to see it as involving this strong normative dimension. Like we yearn, if we put it maybe in like Platonic terms, like for the good or for the beautiful, right? I'm thinking of your podcast name here, right? Reflecting on beauty, right? That calls out a deep longing from us, right? This sort of reaching out to something, some mode of existence where we feel like we'll be more as we should be, or, have that experience of fulfillment or a deeper sense of meaning in life. And so there is this like more strongly like normative dimension to yearning or longing. We feel in a way called or like drawn to it in some way, right? That's different than craving, right? Like it's like you have a craving, you have a like desire to scratch an itch, right? But that's different from like longing for like connection with your spouse or, with others around the world or with nature. There's some sense we feel called or drawn into some deeper sense of goodness, of purpose. And I think it is, longing is another term, comes from a German roots that sort of like means like lying and like reaching out, right? It's like kind of reaching out. I think it goes back to like that experience of like loneliness too. It's like a reaching out for something that we think would fulfill us. And so I actually think it's hard to like completely articulate it because it has this open-ended quality to it. When we yearn for something, we're not quite sure, but we think something's maybe missing. It's like when we have that experience of something maybe missing in our lives that we yearn for something, right? And we yearn for that deeper connection with others, with the good, however we want to describe it.
Yeah. There's a philosopher of aesthetics, Crispin Starkwell, who argues that he defines beauty as the object of our longing. Whatever it is we're longing for, that's what beauty is. And that's an interesting kind of way of characterizing beauty. And I'm curious to know, maybe Daryl, like, what do you think psychologically the valences of these yearnings are? I don't know if you've already seen this in your research, but is it oriented towards something that one could call beauty? And also, do you see any kind of personality dimension? Like, are there some personality types that yearn more than others?
Yeah, so we were actually quite curious, like, are these yearnings a good thing or a bad thing, right? Like, if I'm yearning, maybe it's a deficit, but maybe if I'm yearning, it's, well, I want to grow in some way. So far, the early returns on the data suggest that yearnings are seen as mildly positive. So it's not bad. So when people are experiencing yearning, this isn't an aversive thing. So that's one thing we've realized. We haven't yet gotten into the personality features. It's on our list. So stay tuned for that. I don't want to speak ahead of the data. I could make some predictions, but we're still not quite there. But I would be quite curious to see if there are people that are more naturally inclined to yearn, right? If they're higher in openness to new experience, for example, we might imagine they might be more likely to yearn. But we're not quite sure yet. The data aren't there.
Yeah, yeah. I have, an image of like, a life that is driven by yearning versus its various other alternatives. I mean, certainly one would be the kind of maybe scaffolded life where one is insulated from this, which I'd mentioned. An alternative might be, or maybe this is also a form of the scaffolded life, but it's a caricature of Jane Austen's sort of world of, restrained people, like Victorian England or something of that sort, where you if you look at the life of yearning as, say, a Sufi mystic, or like a desert father, or one of those people living out this deep spiritual yearning, you could see these other modes of life perhaps as being alternatives that for some are compelling, or at least, one could say there's a virtuous life being lived out in the Victorian mode. I don't personally find that a really, I don't know. It seems that it requires so much social scaffolding to be able to construct that sort of life, that it seems, anyway, psychologically sort of not really a sustainable project. And somehow, if we could figure out how to better confront and encounter and deal with these existential questions, it might actually serve us better. But that might be my prejudice. I don't know. Daryl, what do you think as a psychologist in terms of thinking about fullness from a psychological perspective?
So I could not agree with you more. That I think that the only pathway to authentic flourishing is through an acceptance and a real engagement with existential realities. I think a lot of psychological dis-ease, a lot of defensiveness, a lot of interpersonal conflict, intra-group turmoil, ideologically motivated violence stems from our inability or unwillingness to see existential concerns as the realities they are. And so if we could work together personally and collectively to embrace these existential realities as truths and not threats, as facts and not fears, I think that it would be transformative, because that's the only way to fully appreciate what it means to be a bounded human, and then make decisions in light of that to engage in a full and flourishing life. Otherwise, we're just reacting, we're being defensive, we're trying to skirt the issue or avoid the fact that we have to encounter these fundamental features of being human. We're running from and trying to elude our human boundedness. And I think embracing it is the only pathway to flourish.
Do you have recommendations for how one would go about doing that? What could that look like?
Well, it's not easy. I think a big reason why we've evolved these complex and sophisticated psychological defense mechanisms is it's rather terrifying. And I think, Brandon, I think you mentioned it, that, I think suffering and adversity have a way of thrusting these existential realities into the forefront of our minds. And it's harder to avoid. One of the recommendations is when people experience adversity, suffering, when they encounter the harsh realities of existential concerns, that they use that time to really engage with them and start seeing them for what they are and start accepting them. It's much easier to do in the comfort and luxury when you're feeling, when life is more settled and you're not undergoing, the maelstrom of stress and adversity. But we often don't seek that out because we don't want to psychologically rock the boat. Irvin Yalom has a book called Staring at the Sun, and it's kind of coming to terms with, for example, like death. And so it's basically like we have to habituate ourselves over time to these types of realities. And so, there's been work on, for example, terror management theory, which suggests that reminders of death make people really defensive. But then what they found was these trends are reversed among older adults. And the reason for that was because they were thinking, well, they're just more habituated in the reminders of their own mortality. Their friends are dying. They're thinking about it. So the more we talk about and can actually embrace these existential concerns, I think the more habituated we will become, and the less defensive and reactive we will be. So having these conversations, actually engaging in them in times of calm and peace, but also in times of suffering and adversity. The more we have these conversations and the more people are willing to take the hard look, the more able they will become to move toward acceptance rather than defensiveness.
Thank you. David, what do you think?
Yeah, I was thinking, so you were asking about humility earlier, or you mentioned it as we might come back to here. And so I think, Daryl mentioned acceptance and sort of brought me back to mind of my most recent book is called The Virtues of Limits. And I talk about these, what I call two fundamental existential stances. One is the accepting, appreciating stance, and the other is the choosing, controlling stance. And I think both are actually really important in human life. And the sort of trick is how to get it right. If you go like too far in acceptance, it just becomes a kind of quietism, right? Where you just sort of like let things lie. You don't try any kind of change or improvement in one's life. The choosing, controlling stance we take up whenever we seek improvement, but it can also become this kind of Promethean project of mastery, right? It can also be going back to kind of what you were saying, Brandon, earlier about trying to insulate yourself, right? So I think humility is really important because I think it sort of acknowledges that it's a sort of proper recognition of our place in the world. And I think it's actually really closely connected with reverence, that there are things of value beyond ourselves, maybe even of greater value. So it helps to define your proper place in the scheme of things, so to speak. But I think humility also allows for a kind of proper receptivity. So I think one of the things that we need to cultivate is I think we think a lot in sort of modern American culture about individual choice and control and so forth, but cultivating like a posture of receptivity is much more difficult. And I think if you look at a lot of the sort of ancient spiritual practices, a lot of them involve what we call practices of receptivity, whether that's like prayer or meditation, contemplation, right? And so I think that's really one of the greater challenges. I'm brought to mind of like Pascal's remark that, sort of the great sort of besetting condition is that we don't know how to like sit quietly alone in our rooms, right? We're always sort of trying to constantly distract ourselves. It's a sort of expression of our sort of spiritual predicament, trying to avoid, I kind of back to your comment about insulating ourselves, right? We're really good at distracting ourselves, and our modern technologies have made that all the more easy, right? And so to try to cultivate modes of receptivity or sort of proper responsiveness to the sort of the good and the beautiful and the true that's all around us, I think is one of the real challenge. Like you think of Matthew Crawford's book, The World Outside of Your Head, the sort of issue of attention, which, you see that in Iris Murdoch or Simone Weil, this issue that attention is a really important part of the spiritual life, and it's a receptive mode of being. It's kind of, Simone Weil talks about waiting on God. We could talk about like waiting for the good or the beautiful, trying to be receptive to like what comes to us. And so in that sense, I think it is kind of like a spiritual task to learn how to be properly attentive or receptive to sort of the existential realities that are all around us. We can try to ignore them. That's why we distract ourselves. But it does seem like sooner or later we come up against them. So why not just work on dealing with them now rather than being sort of caught off guard, so to speak. But, probably still will be caught off guard because that's the human condition. But yeah, no, I think, it gets to, I think, something really important and connects with this issue of humility that I think is really important.
It seems that attention becomes incredibly fraught resource in a world in which there's so much monetary incentive to colonize our attention, right? And so there are lots of powers that stand to gain from fracking our attention, as D. Graham Burnett puts it. So it's a tough battle. What questions do you guys have for each other? I know you all are in conversation with as part of your own project on this, but is there anything that comes up that you want to ask?
Yeah, we've been talking for a bit. It's been wonderful. I think I've just been very interested in the empirical side, sort of that Daryl looks at with the people who are dones or nuns, like what are their experiences? So I think Daryl already touched on some of this. Do they have spiritual longings? Maybe one in the moment would, so I mentioned, sort of from my philosopher's armchair, I kind of have this sense that there's challenges and opportunities, I guess, with in terms of spiritual yearning and spiritual, seeking meaning, there is that, go back to Nietzsche, that sort of sense of disorientation that can arise. And I think Daryl touches on that with the existential chasm, but maybe also that side of spiritual possibilities. Daryl, do you find that like that there's a sense, that people feel like there's these spiritual possibilities, that things are like sort of opened up to them in a way? Or is it like maybe like almost too much choice? I mean, this is something Taylor talks about in A Secular Age, sort of the optionality of different perspectives. Like we can almost feel like paralyzed and like not knowing where to go, which path to choose. What do you see on that, Daryl?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. So I do think that there are these twin, right? It's kind of those twin feelings again of awe and dread, right? It's the twin feelings of grief and sadness and fear, but also awe and wonder and curiosity. So I kind of think about it as when they're in the existential chasm, there's this sense of being untethered. And for some people who are, high on a growth orientation, that feels great. And it feels good to have the world of possibilities. But for those who are high in security orientation, being untethered feels very groundless, and that feels very anxiety provoking. And sometimes we can have both of those feelings within us, just depending on the context. And so, yeah, I think that there's a combination of possibility and concern, of anxiety and curiosity, of wonder and of fear. Wonder and fear sometimes are very closely, there's a thin line between those two. And I think that's one of the areas we're seeing that. Yeah, David, I guess just for you, my one last question, David, would be, what do you see as the future? If you're seeing an increasing spiritual alienation, if you were to prognosticate, what would you see moving forward?
Yeah, so I don't think religion's going to go away, for instance. I mean, I think they're just sort of tried and true practices. And they also meet needs for human belonging. So I wouldn't accept going back to sort of like there's the death of God view of secularization, where like religion's just going to completely fade away. And in fact, just on like birth rates alone, I know Pew has sort of estimated the world's getting more religious, just not maybe in like America or Europe. But yeah, it's hard to predict the future. Prognostication is not typically my forte, but I think we can expect, if it is true that we are sort of meaning-seeking creatures, we are, and we have a spiritual predicament. I think the great spiritual traditions are always going to offer sort of pathways. And I think for belonging, for spiritual practices that sort of orient us towards the good. But I think oftentimes what we'll have is people, Robert Wuthnow has this distinction between seekers and dwellers. And so I think we do have a world of seekers, but I think even dwellers are going to be seekers as well. So you might call it kind of a seeker-dweller conjunction that people like, they may sort of have eclectic spiritual practices. They may sort of inhabit a spiritual tradition, but seek from out of that, spiritual religious tradition. And so I think spiritual seeking is going to continue. And I think, in some ways, I think that what the data suggests on like the rise of the nuns is that, some of what you have is sort of like low practicing. The amount of like people are like, like very serious in their practice is maybe roughly the same, but it may even decrease more. That certainly has happened in Europe. So it's hard to prognosticate, but kind of going back to your points, religions have addressed these existential concerns. And so it's hard to see the great religions as sort of completely being eradicated. I think their numbers may be less, but they're going to be there as sort of resources for people who are spiritually seeking. And so I just don't think spiritual longing or seeking is going to go. I think that's what I feel most confident saying, is that it's not going away. It's just part of the human condition. And I think because traditional religions are sort of, tested practices and they've been helpful for people, sometimes not helpful, but oftentimes helpful as well. I think they'll continue to have a role in human life, even if maybe somewhat of a reduced role than it has been in the past. That's my best prognosis. I'm not going to give you numbers or percentages or
no, that's
my
great.
pay
That's
grade.
perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's super important to think about, and I think especially in a context in which there's a lot of incentives for various entities to prey on all of our longings and yearnings, right? And whether for belonging or to connect with others, etc., and to cultivate healthy forms of healthy responses to those yearnings becomes really, really critical. So we'll direct our readers and listeners to your websites. And is there anything else anything else you're working on or that's coming out that you want to draw people's attention to?
I don't think so. I mean,
no, I appreciate you directing them to our books, and your readers and listeners will know that we're both working independently, but also collaboratively on some work on spiritual yearning. So hopefully in the next couple of years, we'll be able to report back on what the future holds.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Brandon. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, for me too. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, folks, that's a wrap for this episode. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with someone who would find it of interest. Also, please subscribe and leave us a review if you haven't already. Thanks, and see you next time.